The dust settled in a slow, silent spiral, a pale ghost in the beam of Mark's headlamp. Below the fractured concrete, the void yawned. It wasn't a natural cavity or a simple drain pipe. It was a space that had been meticulously carved out, a man-made absence where solid earth should have been. The air that seeped up was cold and dead, carrying the metallic tang of something long sealed away. He felt the blood recede from his face, a cold rush of adrenaline replacing the warmth. The initial tremor of discovery gave way to a sickening dread. His eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the signature, a stylized, looping R, spray-painted in a faded electric blue on the iron I-beam that spanned the darkness. It was a brand he knew intimately. Every single one of the half-dozen HOA violation notices that had been taped to his front door since he moved in bore that exact same signature in Richard Sterling's spidery handwriting, a perfect, precise R, a symbol of an infuriating, nitpicking authority that had declared war on the errant dandelion in his lawn and the 2-inch height variance of his mailbox. But this was different. This wasn't an official stamp. This was a personal declaration of ownership on a place that didn't belong to him. He knelt, his knees protesting on the rough concrete. The humming sound was louder now, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to vibrate through the soles of his work boots. He reached into the gaping hole, his fingers brushing against a loose wire. It was slick with grime and led down into the darkness. Swallowing hard, he slid his sledgehammer back against the wall, its metallic clatter sounding deafeningly loud in the sudden silence of the basement. He needed to see. He needed to know. The curiosity was a gnawing beast inside him, devouring his fear and leaving only a furious need for answers. He grabbed a utility knife and carefully peeled back the rubber casing of the wire. It was a power line, cleanly spliced and running, down to a source he couldn't see. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The hidden space was powered. This wasn't some long-forgotten, half-finished project from a previous owner. This was an active, intentional room. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the cluttered basement, the boxes of his life, the tools he had yet to unpack, the unfinished DIY projects. Everything in this house felt like his, except for this one, gaping alien secret under his feet. He found a small rusted crowbar and began to pry at the edges of the newly formed opening. The concrete gave way with surprising ease. It wasn't just a random patch. It was a carefully constructed false floor, laid over the real foundation. He worked for 10 minutes, sweat beading on his forehead as he tore away the concrete and the thick, black vapor barrier underneath. A square opening, roughly 4 by 5 feet, appeared. He shone his light down into the blackness. The air was a stagnant, heavy blanket, and the humming was now a distinct, rhythmic pulse. The space wasn't deep. It was maybe 6 feet down, with a proper concrete floor and walls, a small insulated vault of a room. A ladder, old but sturdy, was bolted to the far wall. Mark hesitated for only a second. He knew, with a certainty that iced his veins, that he shouldn't go down there. He should call the police. He should get a lawyer. He should run. But his legs were already swinging over the edge. He gripped the cold metal rungs and descended, the sound of his boots on the ladder echoing eerily. The room was cramped, but the air felt slightly less stale down here. A single bare bulb hung from a wire, humming and flickering, providing the source of the noise. The walls were a smooth, reinforced concrete, painted a dull gray. There was no furniture, just a small workbench built into one wall, cluttered, with tools. But what held his attention were the two objects on the bench. One was a worn, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with what looked like meticulous, spidery handwriting. The other was a small, black surveillance camera, the kind you could buy online, with a long fiber optic cable snaking out from its back. The cable disappeared into a narrow, perfectly drilled hole in the concrete wall, leading up toward the ceiling. He followed its path with his eyes, a horrifying new understanding dawning on him. The camera was pointed up to a tiny, almost invisible gap in the very foundation he had been standing on, pointed up to the drain in his basement floor. It was a pinhole camera, and its lens was aimed right at the heart of his new home. He reached for the notebook, his fingers trembling. The first entry was dated almost 2 years ago, a full year before he had even bought the house. The handwriting was neat, the tone clinical and detached. Project, The Orchard. The name made no sense. He flipped a few pages, page after page of what looked like a detailed log, dates, times, observations. 12/14/23, House 416, foundation stable. Sewer line rerouted. New owners expected Q2 2024. Plan remains on schedule. House 416. That was his address. Mark felt the blood pound in his ears. This wasn't just a hidden room. This was a private command center, a place from which Richard had been watching, waiting, and planning. Planning what? He couldn't even begin to imagine. He heard the distant, muffled sound of the back door to his house opening upstairs. Sarah was home. He quickly shoved the notebook and the camera into his work bag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get out of there. He climbed the ladder, sealed the space with the crowbar, and hid the concrete and dust under a tarp. He had barely finished cleaning himself up before he heard Sarah calling his name from the top of the basement stairs. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the notebook and camera on the floor in his work bag, a terrifying secret between them. He told her everything, his voice low and urgent. He laid out the timeline, the signature, the camera, the logbook. Sarah, a pragmatist by nature, listened with a frown of increasing disbelief. "Mark, this is insane," she said, shaking her head. "You found a room, okay? Maybe the old owners were eccentric. And the camera, maybe it's for rodents or something." "The R is his signature, Sarah, and the notebook has our address dated before we even moved in," Mark insisted, his voice tight with frustration. "He's been watching us, and not just us. The book mentions Project The Orchard. What does that even mean?" "It means you're jumping to conclusions," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. She saw the wild, panicked look in his eyes and the way his hands were shaking. She knew him well enough to know this wasn't a game. "Look, we need to call someone. We need to call the police." "And say what?" "My HOA president, who's a pillar of the community, built a secret room under my house and might be watching us. They'll laugh us out of the precinct. They'll tell us to handle it with the HOA board, which, by the way, he controls." He was right, and they both knew it. Richard Sterling was a retired accountant who had served as the president of the Cypress Grove HOA for 2 decades. He was a local institution, a man who organized the block parties, the annual Christmas light judging, and the community garage sale. He was universally respected, if a little feared for his meticulous adherence to the bylaws. To accuse him of something so bizarre and malicious was professional and social suicide. "Okay," Sarah said slowly, her own fear beginning to bleed through her pragmatism. "Okay, so what do we do?" "We get more evidence," Mark said, his jaw set. "I need to talk to him. I need to get a read on him, to see if he'll give himself away." The next day, Mark waited until he saw Richard in his front yard, meticulously trimming a hedge that was already mathematically perfect. Mark walked over, feigning a friendly, neighborly smile he didn't feel. "Hey, Richard," Mark said, leaning on the post of Richard's mailbox. The man was in his late 60s, ramrod straight, with a severe haircut and an expression that never changed from one of mild disapproval. "Good afternoon, Mark," Richard said, his tone dry. He didn't stop trimming. "I trust your new gutter installation is up to code?" Oh, yeah, all good. Just a quick question, if you don't mind. I was doing a little work in the basement, just to get a feel for the foundation. And I noticed some of the old blueprints were a little vague. Richard's hands paused. For a fraction of a second. The head shears went silent. His head didn't turn, but Mark could feel his eyes on him. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with a meaning Mark was only beginning to grasp. Vague? Richard finally said, his voice flat. The blueprints for every home in this community are a matter of public record. They are a uniform design. I assure you, there is no ambiguity. Yeah, I found this one weird patch of concrete. It looked newer than the rest. Just wondering if you, as the longtime president, knew if the previous owners did any major work down there. The shears started again. Faster now, a furious clipping of non-existent branches. The previous owners of your home were a lovely retired couple, Mark. They did nothing but tend to their garden. Your assumption of major work is frankly insulting. Right. Sorry, didn't mean to imply anything, Mark said, stepping back slightly, his fake smile feeling like a mask about to crack. It's just that I found this old, rusted wire running down, and I was worried about it being a fire hazard. Richard stopped trimming, finally turning to face Mark. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were cold and hard. Mark, let me be clear. I have been the steward of this community for 23 years. I know every square foot of every lot. There are no rusted wires and no weird... Part 2. The Orchard's Root. The words swam before Mark's eyes, a final, horrifying sentence scrawled in hurried ink. Don't let him discover the server in the crawl space of House 420. The whole thing depends on it. The low hum of the hidden room's bare bulb seemed to take on a new, menacing tone, a digital heartbeat counting down the seconds to an unknown catastrophe. Mark's blood ran cold, the fear he had suppressed since the discovery of the R now clawing its way up his throat. This wasn't a petty feud anymore. This was a secret, and it was alive, sprawling and dangerous, with roots that extended beyond the concrete under his feet. He clutched the leather-bound notebook, his knuckles white. The initial shock gave way to a surge of adrenaline, a desperate clarity born from a sudden, undeniable threat. He wasn't just a nosy neighbor. He was a liability. Richard knew he was getting close, and the list of fines was not just punishment, it was a diversion. An attempt to occupy him, to make him focus on the small, infuriating details while the real secret, the real crime, lay hidden a few houses down the street. The orchard wasn't a landscaping project, it was a sinister network, and he had just found the server that powered the entire operation. He climbed out of the hidden room, his movements hurried and clumsy. He sealed the space, his mind racing. He had to tell Sarah. He had to explain the new, terrifying reality. He found her in the living room, a stack of bills on her lap, her face drawn with exhaustion and frustration. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with worry. The fines keep coming, Mark. Another one today. The gutter is apparently non-conforming now. What's even a non-conforming gutter? He sat on the couch, the work bag with the notebook and camera slung between them like a grenade. He took a deep breath, the stale basement air still clinging to his clothes. Sarah, listen to me. I was in the room again. I found something. It's not a secret surveillance room for our house. It's a command center for something much bigger. He pulled out the notebook and flipped to the last page, holding it out for her to see. She read the final entry, her eyes widening with each word. The color drained from her face as she read the name, House 420. A server? She whispered, her voice barely a breath. What does that mean? What's he doing with a server? I don't know, Mark said, his mind furiously trying to connect the dots. But the notebook calls his project the Orchard, and a server is where you store data, surveillance footage, personal information, bank records maybe. He's not just watching us. He's watching the whole neighborhood. Sarah looked at him, her fear morphing into a cold, hard resolve. We have to get that server. We can't go to the police with a crazy theory and a notebook from a secret room. We need hard evidence. We need to know what's on that server. They pulled up the plat map of the neighborhood on their laptop. House 420 was 3 doors down from them, a 2-story colonial with pristine white siding and an immaculately manicured lawn. It was owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, a widow who, according to Richard's own newsletters, was often away visiting her children. She was the ideal target for a long-term clandestine operation. She wouldn't be home to notice. A new wire or an unusual hum. He's been using her house, Mark said, tracing the path from their home to hers on the map. He had a key, or he broke in, or he's got something set up where he can access the crawl space. The next few days were a blur of nervous energy and heightened paranoia. The fines continued to arrive, a new one every morning, each one more ridiculous than the last. The HOA bulletin board, which Richard updated daily, had new rules posted. No overnight guests without pre-approval, all exterior lighting must be a specific wattage, and a warning about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Mark and Sarah knew the last one was aimed squarely at them. Richard wasn't just harassing them, he was building a case against them, turning the entire community against them. They felt watched, judged, and increasingly isolated. Mark spent his mornings watching House 420 from his upstairs window, a pair of binoculars in his hands, feeling like a character in a bad spy movie. He noted Mrs. Gable's movements. She left for her daily walk at 9 a.m. sharp and returned at 10:30 a.m. A car would come once a week, a landscape maintenance company, but they never went near the foundation. The crawl space entry would likely be on the side of the house, a small door with a latch. Richard, he noted, always drove his golf cart past her house exactly at 11:15 a.m. and 3:45 p.m. He was checking on it, checking on his server. The window of opportunity was narrow, a Sunday morning when Richard was known to attend church and Mrs. Gable would be on her walk. They had to be in and out in less than an hour. Sarah was hesitant, her hands twisting nervously. "This is breaking and entering, Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "If he catches us, we're finished. He'll have us arrested. We'll lose everything." "If we don't do this, we lose everything anyway," Mark countered, his voice low and firm. "He's not going to stop. He's going to bleed us dry with fines and make us pariahs in our own home. We're already on his radar. At least this way, we have a fighting chance." They agreed. They planned it like a heist. Sarah would act as the lookout, parked down the street in their car, a burner phone in her hand. Mark would approach the house from the rear, using the dense foliage of the neighbor's yard for cover. He packed a small bag, a headlamp, wire cutters, a portable hard drive, and a crowbar. He hated every single second of this, but the thought of Richard's smug, infuriating face was all the fuel he needed. Sunday morning arrived, a bright, deceptively peaceful day. At 8:58 a.m., they saw Mrs. Gable emerge from her front door, a sun hat on her head. The door clicked shut behind her. She walked off down the street, her pace slow and steady. At 9:05 a.m., Mark gave Sarah a small nod. He grabbed his bag, his heart, a frantic drum against his ribs. He moved quickly, his senses on high alert. The world seemed to shrink to the space between him and House 420. The rustle of a bush, the bark of a dog, a car passing in the distance, every sound was a potential disaster. He reached the side of the house, a deep breath escaping his lungs in a silent puff. He found the crawlspace entrance immediately, a small, square wooden door. It was bolted shut, not with a padlock, but with a complex electronic keypad lock. His heart sank. He hadn't accounted for this. This was no simple storage space. This was a vault. But the notebook, he remembered, mentioned the crawl space. It was the right place. Richard wouldn't have built a secret room under his own house and left this one unprotected. He ran his hand along the side of the door, feeling for anything out of place. He found it. A small, almost invisible wire snaking from the keypad into the ground. It wasn't the main power, it was a data line. The system was networked. He pulled out his wire cutters. A frantic, desperate gamble. He cut the wire. The small red LED on the keypad went dark. He pulled the crowbar from his bag and pried at the door. The wood gave way with a sharp crack, the sound echoing in his ears like a gunshot. He winced, listening for any sign of a neighbor. Nothing. He shoved the door aside, and the dark, damp, earthy smell of a crawl space wafted up. He switched on his headlamp and lowered himself into the space. The ground was packed dirt, littered, with old pipes and the skeletons of long-dead rodents. It was a suffocatingly tight space. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, following a series of neatly laid power cables. He crawled for what felt like an eternity, the dust and cobwebs clinging to his face, until he saw it. Tucked away in the far corner behind a series of air ducts was a metal rack. On the rack sat not one, but 3 large industrial-grade servers, their lights blinking rhythmically, the source of the persistent hum he had heard under his own home. This was a professional operation, not the hobby of an obsessive old man. A small workstation was set up next to them, a monitor, a keyboard, and a small, fan-cooled laptop. He pulled out his portable hard drive and a set of cables, his hands, shaking so badly he could barely plug them in. He needed to get the data. He needed to get it all. He started the download, the progress bar on the small screen, a slow, agonizing crawl. As the data transferred, he clicked through the files, his headlamp illuminating the screen. He saw the folder labeled The Orchard. Inside were subfolders, for every house in the neighborhood, each one with a number. He clicked on his own, 416. Inside were thousands of video files, surveillance footage from the pinhole camera under his house, dated all the way back to the day they moved in. He saw himself, Sarah, their friends, all completely unaware, all being recorded. There were also documents, financial records, and emails. He clicked on another folder, The Roots, and found a horrifying collection of blackmail files on half. A dozen neighbors, complete with photos, recordings, and personal secrets. Richard hadn't just been watching. He had been collecting leverage. He was controlling the entire neighborhood, not with bylaws, but with blackmail and surveillance. The download was at 80%. He had to be quick. He looked at the time on the laptop. 10:25 a.m. Mrs. Gable would be home in 5 minutes. He heard the sound then. A distant, muffled, metallic clang. It sounded like a car door shutting. It was too early for Mrs. Gable. It was too early for Richard's patrol. He froze, his entire body going rigid. He heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel, a steady, deliberate tread that was not the light shuffle of an... The shaft of sunlight from the open crawl space door turned the dust motes into a blinding, shimmering cloud. Richard's silhouette filled the opening, a dark, immovable force of nature. His face, when he finally stepped down, was not one of rage, but of a chilling disappointment, as if Mark were a particularly difficult piece of trash he had just discovered on his perfect lawn. "Mark," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "I should have known. You're a problem solver. You fix things. I saw that in the way you organized your garage. You are a threat to order." He moved with a speed that belied his age, a crowbar clutched in his hand like an extension of his will. The space was too tight for Mark to stand, too low for him to run. He was on his knees, a rat trapped in a maze he had foolishly crawled into. The portable hard drive, hot and heavy in his hand, felt like a grenade with the pin pulled. "It's not what you think," Mark lied, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. "Oh, but it is," Richard said, his gaze flicking from Mark's face to the hard drive. "I saw your car parked down the street. I knew you hadn't left. I came to check on my security. And here you are. A little scavenger crawling through the dirt, trying to steal what doesn't belong to you. Richard took another step forward, the crowbar scraping against a pipe. You don't understand, Mark. The orchard is a necessity. A community like this doesn't run on good faith. It runs on data. I know who's cheating on their taxes, who's having an affair, who's dealing with a gambling problem. I use that data to keep them in line, to make them do their part. It's all for the greater good. It's a perfect ecosystem. You, Mark, are an invasive species. He was a madman, but a lucid one. He truly believed in his own twisted brand of justice. He was not a villain. He was a sociopath, a meticulous administrator of a dystopian paradise. Mark felt a surge of cold. Fury! This man had been watching him, blackmailing his neighbors, all while presenting himself as the benevolent patriarch of Cypress Grove. "Give me the drive, Mark," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And I'll make this quick and painless. I can claim you broke in, got electrocuted by a faulty wire. It'll be a sad but perfectly plausible story. The community will mourn your carelessness." Mark shook his head. The hard drive clutched against his chest. "No, everyone will know." "No one knows," Richard said, a humorless smile playing on his lips. "Because I am the one who tells them what to know." Suddenly, a loud, sustained car horn blared from the street. It was Sarah. She was signaling, warning him, a frantic, desperate signal. The distraction was all Mark needed. He threw a handful of dirt from the floor directly into Richard's face. The older man flinched, a grunt of surprise escaping his lips. In that split second, Mark lunged, scrambling past Richard's legs. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his ankle as the crowbar caught him. He screamed, pulling himself forward with a desperate animal strength. He crawled through the opening, half falling, half crawling out into the light of the side yard. Richard was right behind him, a furious, grunting shadow. Mark scrambled to his feet, a searing pain shooting up from his twisted ankle. He didn't have time to process it. He could only run. He limped, stumbling, across the manicured lawn of House 420. The chase was on. He was fast, but his ankle was a fiery weight. Richard, enraged, was surprisingly quick on his feet, his decades of control giving him a desperate, frantic energy. Mark heard the thud of his shoes behind him, the rasping of his breath. He could hear Sarah's horn again, louder, more frantic. She was driving toward them. "Stop! Mark! Stop!" Richard yelled. "You have nowhere to go!" Mark ignored him, pushing, his injured body harder. He ran past pristine flower beds, past perfectly aligned mailboxes, a bloodied and terrified fugitive in a place built to be free of all such ugliness. He could see Sarah's car now, stopped at the curb, its hazard lights flashing. She was out of the car, her face a mask of terror. "Run, Mark! Run!" she screamed. But Richard was gaining on him. Mark stumbled and fell on the sidewalk, the hard drive, skidding across the concrete, a small black beacon of his failure. Richard was on him in an instant, a fistful of Mark's shirt in his hand, the crowbar raised. "It's over, Mark!" he snarled. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos, clear and strong. "Richard, what is going on?" Mark looked up. A woman stood on her front porch, her hands on her hips, a phone pressed to her ear. It was Mrs. Miller, a sweet-faced retiree from House 418, just 2 doors down. She had been a key witness to Mark's fines, a passive spectator to Richard's harassment. Now she was looking at the scene unfolding on her lawn, a bleeding neighbor, a frantic wife, and the respectable HOA president with a crowbar in his hand. The perfect facade had finally cracked. Richard froze, the crowbar still raised. His eyes, full of a manic rage, flickered to Mrs. Miller, then back to Mark. The sight of another witness, someone he thought he had under his thumb, momentarily broke his focus. It's nothing, Carol. This man broke into my property. He's been vandalizing the community," Richard stammered, his carefully constructed persona beginning to crumble. "He was just in the crawl space of my house, Carol," Mark gasped, his voice raw. He pointed at the hard drive, which lay innocently on the sidewalk. "He's been running a surveillance network from there. He's been blackmailing everyone." "That's a lie! He's a menace!" Richard shrieked, his composure completely gone. He lunged for the hard drive, but it was too late. Mrs. Miller was no fool. She had seen the frantic rage, the desperate lies, the crowbar. Her face hardened, her previous deference to Richard replaced with a look of dawning horror. "I don't know what you're doing, Richard," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "But I've already called the police, and I'm recording this entire thing." She held up her phone, the red light of the video camera a final, damning piece of evidence. Richard stood frozen, his eyes darting between Mark on the ground, Sarah with her phone, and Mrs. Miller. The perfectly manicured lawn, the meticulously trimmed bushes, the quiet, safe street. It all felt like a stage set now, and the audience was beginning to see the man behind the curtain. The power he had wielded for decades was based on an illusion of control. Now, that illusion was shattered. He looked at the hard drive on the sidewalk, the tiny object holding a virtual world of secrets. He looked at Mark, bruised and bleeding but alive. He looked at Mrs. Miller, her face a testament to his final, complete failure. Then he looked at his house, his kingdom, the perfect symbol of his perfect life. It was all a lie, and the lie was over. He lowered the crowbar, a defeated man in a world of his own making, a world that was now, finally, watching him back. Part 4. The Harvest of Deception. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the manicured lawns and pristine white siding of Cypress Grove, a stark, violent contrast to the quiet perfection Richard Sterling had so meticulously cultivated. The surreal theater of his public unraveling had drawn neighbors from their homes, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and dawning, gut-wrenching realization. Mark, his ankle throbbing with a fire he was trying to ignore, sat on the curb, his back against a patrol car, watching his perfect new neighborhood crumble. Two officers were speaking to Mrs. Miller, who, with her phone still clutched in her hand, was a suddenly formidable witness. Another officer was talking to a furious, disheveled Richard, who was now being carefully cuffed, the rigid posture of a community leader replaced by the slumped shoulders of a broken man. The crowbar lay on the ground next to the portable hard drive, a silent testament to the violence that had just unfolded. Sarah stood next to Mark, her arm around his shoulders, her body trembling with a combination of fear and relief. "You'll want to take a look at this?" Mark said, his voice raspy. He held out the hard drive to a plainclothes detective who had just arrived on the scene. "It's all on here. The surveillance, the blackmail, everything." The detective, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Miller, took the drive. "What are we looking at here, son?" "The orchard," Mark said, a bitter taste in his mouth. "That's what he called it. It's a surveillance and blackmail network. He had a server in the crawl space of House 420. He was watching everyone." Mark and Sarah spent the next 2 hours recounting the entire story, from the hairline crack in the basement to the desperate confrontation in the crawl space. The officers, initially skeptical, started to believe them when a search warrant for House 420 was fast-tracked and executed. Within the hour, an entire forensic team descended on the seemingly innocuous home. The discovery was immediate and damning. They found the servers, the meticulously logged surveillance footage, the financial records, and the blackmail files. The police tape around Mrs. Gable's home, the sterile blue lights of the forensics team, all of it turned the tranquil cul-de-sac into a crime scene. A second search warrant was issued for Richard Sterling's home. The officers found the hidden room under Mark's house, along with the notebook detailing Project The Orchard. The case was open and shut. As the news spread, the quiet, peaceful veneer of Cypress Grove was ripped away to reveal the festering rot beneath. Mark and Sarah became the center of a storm of attention. Some neighbors, like Mrs. Miller, came to them, tearful and apologetic. She had been one of Richard's primary targets, blackmailed into voting for his every initiative because he had dirt on her estranged son. Others, the ones who had sided with Richard during the HOA meetings, were cold and resentful. They didn't want their perfect world to be a lie. They didn't want to admit they had been manipulated. They wanted to blame Mark for destroying their peace, even if that peace had been built on a foundation of surveillance and fear. Mark and Sarah, however, were too busy dealing with the fallout to pay them much mind. The physical pain in Mark's ankle was a dull ache compared to the emotional weight of it all. Their home, once a symbol of their new beginning, now felt tainted, a monument to the dangerous secret hidden beneath their feet. They couldn't walk into the basement without seeing the ghost of the secret room, couldn't look out the window without thinking of the cameras and the stolen moments. The official news came 2 days later. Richard Sterling, a man once praised for his community spirit, was being charged with multiple felonies, including stalking, wiretapping, and extortion. The hard drive had been a treasure trove of evidence, not just against Richard, but against a network of people who had been his complicit lackeys. The Orchard Project wasn't just a personal obsession, it was a business. Richard had been providing data, blackmail, and influence to a number of powerful people outside of the neighborhood. The blackmail money wasn't just going into his pockets. It was being funneled into a shadowy, larger organization. The perfect little neighborhood was just a small piece in a much bigger, more sinister puzzle. The news hit them like a fresh wave of terror. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger, unseen danger was now becoming clear. Richard was just the gardener of the orchard, not the one who owned the land. And he had mentioned a co-conspirator to the police during his frantic, unhinged interrogation. Mark and Sarah were now not just victims. They were key witnesses in a much larger criminal investigation. They were no longer the new couple on the block. They were the people who had brought down a kingpin and exposed a criminal conspiracy. Their phones started ringing constantly, with journalists and lawyers, with people wanting their side of the story. They were no longer safe, anonymous homeowners. Their quiet, suburban dream had become a very public, very dangerous nightmare. 1. Evening, Mark was downstairs in the basement, now a sterile, taped-off crime scene. He was retrieving a box of winter clothes, the officers having given him permission to go back in. As he rummaged through the box, his hand brushed against a small, forgotten item at the bottom. It was a single sheet of paper, folded and tucked into an old photograph album he hadn't had a chance to put away. It was a letter, yellowed with age. He opened it, a feeling of dread washing over him. It was a letter from the previous owner, a retired man who, according to Richard, had simply moved away. The letter, however, told a different story. It was addressed to the new owners, a final, desperate warning. "If you find this," the letter began, "I am gone. I did what I could, but he was too powerful. He knows everything. He knows about the tunnels. The other man, he's the one who really runs the show. Be careful. You won't just be dealing with Richard. He is only the face of the operation. He has a partner, a man named Sterling." Mark frowned, his mind reeling. Sterling. That was Richard's last name. The previous owner must have meant someone else. The letter was confusing, disjointed, filled with the paranoid fears of a man on the run. But one part stood out, a sentence scrawled on the bottom in a frantic, hurried hand. "The server isn't the only thing. The real treasure, it's in the foundation of his house. The real server, Richard's, is a decoy." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the floor of his basement, at the spot where the secret room had been, now a sterile rectangle of police tape. Richard had built a small, manageable server room in House 420 as a decoy. The real prize, the true original heart of the orchard, was hidden in the foundation of Richard's own home, under the very ground of the man who had been the architect of all their misery. They had found the fake server, and Richard had sacrificed it to protect the real one. Mark looked up, out of the small basement window, at Richard's perfectly manicured lawn, at the beautiful, sinister house. The true enemy, and the most dangerous, secret, was still standing right in front of them, untouched and undiscovered.